Well, good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning.
So you are my rabbi, but you also have another relation to me.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
What would that be?
I'm your dad.
You are my dad, yes. Yeah. So this has been kind of an adventure for us, hasn't it? Over the past couple years, but really the last year has become something of an adventure.
Yeah, I remember when you and I talked about this, we kind of knew this was on the horizon. We would do a podcast. And then we had this gear, thanks to Richard, sitting in a box. And we thought at some point we have to make it happen. And we did. And then you came in here with tape and paint and created a studio and all the gear. And suddenly it started to become, I felt an obligation to each other because it was real. And we were both investing and invested in it. And it's been full of surprises.
It has. I think starting from the beginning, it's been full of surprises. This kind of kicked off as a conversation that was very, I would say, frustrating for both of us, in so much as you kept getting told, oh, you should have a podcast.
Yeah.
And you'd come to me and we'd talk about, oh yeah, but what would it be about? And what would we do? Would this be just a living room record with our iPhones kind of thing? Who do we have as guests? Is it guests at all? Is it just you talking?
Right.
Because you came from sort of a background within the synagogue of releasing content weekly, little short form videos on your thoughts. And that's what kicked off a lot of people to say, you really need to have a bigger platform where you can spread your ideas and just give people access to your thoughts. So that, I think, was the impetus for this. And it became frustrating because we kept saying, okay, well, we could do it. And everyone else seems to be doing a podcast. And you have a good reach as far as your messaging. So why not start? And then Richard Sperber happened to have a bunch of podcast equipment lying around, namely microphones.
Really great quality gear.
And suddenly that was in our lap. And we thought, well, if we're going to do it, this seems to be the moment to do it. So just asking you, not as your son, but as a viewer, what do you think has been, I'll rephrase, where do you think this started from conceptually for the meaning mindset as it is right now?
Well, first of all, the meaning mindset was already a decision, meaning what are we going to focus it on? Let's narrow in on what we are, what lane we want to be in. Then it was finding the title, and then Janice did these beautiful graphics, and you worked with them and started building the platform. But we still didn't know who the guests were. And then we went from looking at the ceiling, which is what could this be, to we have a guest coming on Monday. And he's going to be in Vienna, and that was Alex Vasily Frankel. And we were suddenly in business, essentially. And I remember one of the things that struck me with Alex was I kind of felt what I felt ever since. This is a privilege.
Yeah.
This is really a privilege. And one of the things that amplified that feeling for me was looking off camera throughout, knowing that my own son is part of this conversation.
Yeah.
And afterwards, we'd finish the conversation with Alex or with any of the great guests we've had, and you and I would look at each other like, did you hear that? We get to be a part of that?
Yeah.
You and I, different places in our lives, obviously, age, but you're also a husband and a dad. There's so many times when somebody said something to me, and I thought, oh, God, my son gets to hear that, which has been...
And you've said that on the podcast.
Oh, yeah, it's been amazing. It's been amazing. And then when you and I drove up to Mammoth, mom with me and your wife and baby with you, and that was great.
Yeah.
And I remember going up there thinking, okay, we're actually now going to somebody's place off-site to do a recording with Steve Searles, the Bear Whisperer. Again, first of all, I thought there was such an interesting, beautiful relationship developing between you and Steve. And I remember at the end of it, you and I went home and you said to me, Dad, I really like that guy. And I thought, yeah, I do too. And as much as he's this gruff mountain man who with all these views on his own life, there was so much wisdom.
Yeah.
And it was a little was about the bears. A lot was just about a man walking through life with missteps like us, falling, stumbling, getting up again, amazing stories. But some of what moved me the most was just his sweet humanity.
Yeah.
The fact that he was willing to talk about how challenging life has been. And that always inspires me. I think I've always been drawn to, even in high school years, I've always been a reader of biographies, which is kind of maybe not typical. Maybe a lot of people love a novel. They want the story.
Well, at that age.
Yeah, at that age.
Yeah.
I wanted to know about people's struggles and stories. And I've always been interested in the struggle more than the success. Mm-hmm. And one thing, if you remember, when we talked about the concept for this show, for this podcast, we said there are people who are famous for having a great throw with their right hand, or being able to do a great dunk shot, or whatever that was that I just did with my hand.
Not a dunk shot, but
yeah.
who am I to know?
That's not as interesting to us and maybe to other people as their story.
Yeah.
What do they wake up with in the middle of the night? What has been their struggle? And we found a lot of that in this, a lot of learning. It's been incredible.
Well, that's kind of been the process, has been learning through this and learning through our guests. And one question I was going to ask you, but I think we can kind of answer it through this conversation, is how have we landed on our guests? How have we landed on the interests that we want to explore? And I think a lot of that has just been speak with a guest, have a great conversation. Obviously, there's little tidbits that don't always make it into the episode, and there's conversations before, there's conversations after, but that has always led us to, oh yeah, we should explore that, where someone says, you should speak to XYZ, because they complement the story I was telling or anything like that. And that has been a huge drive of this podcast is just following the story and following, not in a journalistic sense so much, but following the story of people. One thing you mentioned with Steve was the wisdom that he had and he imparted. And how do you feel that these guests have similarities in that way? Do you think there's a through line of wisdom equals exploration of something in their life equals coming to an exploration of meaning? What does meaning and wisdom have to do with each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the wisdom is like a byproduct. It's like, I remember the book Start With Why, Simon Sinek's book that really influenced me. And why are you doing whatever it is that you're doing, if you're Apple Computers, or if you are Name the Person or the venture? And one of the things I always remember was that the answer to why can never be profit. To get rich, it's probably not going to work. Yeah. It's not going to get to the level of success you want it to be. The byproduct is success, right? Do something because you want to change something in the world or in people's lives. You want to solve a problem. You want to reveal some insights, a story, and the byproduct will be the profit. And in this case, I think the wisdom. So I don't think we've gone into these conversations with these people saying, what wisdom do you have to offer?
Yeah.
I think that's a 5-minute podcast. Instead, we've said, so wait a second, what happened next? Yeah. And out of that, again, thinking about Steve and thinking about Chad Cromwell, talking about going on long walks with Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits. And he said, and the kinds of deep conversations that they would have, and how that really deepened Chad as a drummer. Another thing that struck me when I think about Chad was, I can't take chopsticks and beat them in the right beat. I know as a musician, but that's a real art form. And to think about the discipline that went into that, when he talked about going to Stax Records and they gave him probably a cassette at the time and said, go and beat to that. No, start again. No, start again. No, start again. And then there's a story he told that you probably remember, which is my long way of answering your question.
It's a podcast.
Yeah, where he said he was on a recording and it was going to be a huge, huge hit in country music.
I know the story.
Yeah, and he said, I basically fired myself from the job. He said, because the producer had me doing all this prolific, big drumming in it. And he said, and I just thought, no, I don't want to insert myself here. This just needs to be simple. You don't need me on this.
Yeah.
And I thought, that tells you something about a person's humanity, humility. That's what we're getting out of it. I don't think it's a matter of going straight at meaning. What's meaning after all? or straight at wisdom. What's wisdom after all? It's something that you get out of spending time with another human being.
Yeah, it's the intangible takeaways.
It is.
Sounds like in a way you're saying the wisdom is in the story, and we pull that meaning, whatever we define meaning as, which I want to talk about, as just your takeaway from the experience of living.
Yeah, the way that you deepen yourself through experience. I think there are people who don't necessarily, I don't think experience in itself necessarily yields wisdom. You have to be able to take that experience, be reflective, and realize something about life and yourself to become wiser the next time you're in that situation.
So how would you define wisdom beyond what you just said?
Well, I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't knowledge. It's not the same as knowledge. It's not mathematical, right? My favorite subject. But it's just not. It's not having the answer to certain things that AI or Siri is going to give you. It's coming to certain understandings about being human. That to me is wisdom. And when you and I had Ryan McAnally Lintz and Matt Crosman from Yale talking about their book, which is great book, and I see the cover, and it's called Life Worth Living. I thought, here they were, they pulled together for a course at Yale, #1 course in the humanities department at Yale, and they pulled together for a book, what have the great thinkers of history taught us that we can then turn into our own realized wisdom. So one of the things they do in the book is they'll give you a reference to a story from the Quran. And the point is to show you something about what it is to be human, not to teach you something about a religion. Sure, that's the source, but wisdom is wisdom regardless of where it comes from. By the way, that's a really important point, isn't it? I think sometimes, especially religious people, but it's in politics too. We see it all the time. People are unwilling to listen to another voice that they disagree with, or they're somehow threatened. If I'm a Republican, I can't listen to MSNBC. If I'm a Democrat, I can't listen to Fox. If I am Christian, I can't read a book on Islam. Well, what if all of life has something to offer, and we just get deeper and wiser on the basis of what we learn?
Yeah, and like you said, wisdom is reflective, and I don't think you can pick and choose what contributes to your human wisdom.
Yeah, well said. I agree.
It's just a amalgamation of everything you experience.
Yeah.
So to selectively choose, I'm not going to have that contribute to who I am, have that contribute to my identity, my political, religious identity is not only silly, but not really possible.
Yeah, I think we should be curious. That should be our identity. I mean, I'm not a tattoo guy, but that's what I'd have on my forehead, right? Curious.
Yeah.
And one thing I found interesting with being a podcast host that you're finding interesting right now, I think as well, is we're not reading a script.
Yeah.
Which means to do this well, which we're always trying to do, it means actually to actively listen to what the person is saying across the table and not think, what should I ask next? Just trust that curious conversation is going to evoke more curious conversation without necessarily a goal other than, okay, we're going to explore certain ideas or experiences this person has to offer. I thought Abbie Schiller was...
I was just going to bring her up,
an amazing guest. I think she has to come back in season 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, I just think that's somebody that in an hour, you and I both learned so much from.
Yeah.
What did you get from her? What were some of the takeaways? Because I remember afterwards you and I thanked her. You had to run off to do another job. And we also both looked at each other and went, wow, this was good.
I think for me, during that episode specifically, just a little behind the scenes of it, most of the stuff we do here, we're sitting in person, you and I, either me at the computer or me remotely. We've worked on this from all over the world. And then we have guests out and about. For this episode, I was out and about. I was monitoring it from my phone and I was driving. And something that really stuck with me and I've been doing actually daily since has just been awareness of your body and how to circumvent stress and stressful thoughts through just identifying points of focus in your body.
Yeah.
So on that drive, I was driving my car, and she was talking about bring it to your feet, bring your attention to your toes, and see how many toes you can feel.
Yeah.
And this reminded me of thought stopping, which when I was a little kid, I'd like to say under 6 for how this story goes.
Yeah.
And I was sleeping on my parents', your guys' floor, because I had this terrible nightmare of a bear making its way into the yard and into the house.
Yeah.
Which I'm
Because
still
there
not-
was one in the neighborhood.
There was
by
one in the
way.
neighborhood.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced I'm totally crazy.
So it wasn't a
but
phantom bear.
It might have been a phantom bear. But you taught me something at a very young age, which is how to thought stop. And as I've understood it, it's the process of, for me at least, physically replacing a thought with another thought. So
Yeah.
the way I do it is I will be thinking about something stressful as I'm going to bed, as we all do, and then I will close my eyes, as hopefully I'm already doing, and picture my thoughts as tangible objects, and then just clear them from my view, and then one by one. So as I identified something, I push it to the side. So it's out of, I'm a film guy, I'm a camera guy. So I think of it as just pushing it outside of the frame. And then my focus becomes on maintaining a black frame.
Yeah.
And that is my fall asleep method. So this idea of really honing in your focus on something identifiable, tangible, that can be replacing something in your mind, because we can't multi-think.
Right.
We can
Even though we think
multitask, but we can't. We have to be focusing on one thing at a time. So that really resonated with me, and I shared that with my wife, and that's something that we've been trying to do together. But it's hard, and I think that was one of the takeaways from me from that episode, has been just staying very, very, very present and keeping your mindset on something that is either positive or neutral.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember where I got that from, because I was singing an opera in England, and I had time between rehearsals, and I wanted to learn, and I contacted the local university. I don't know why this came to mind, but I had this thought that opera singers, performers are probably very similar in some ways to professional athletes. And I contacted the university, which was a renowned university in that city, and I said, do you have a sports psychology department? They said, yeah, and they put me in
First of all,
touch
just
with.
to interrupt, only you would do this.
Well, maybe only I did in that case. I don't know, but that tells you I've always been somebody who's interested in deepening myself, my sense of the world, and I wanted to understand from a sports psychologist. And we met. He'd come to my apartment. We'd sit, drink a lot of coffee, and he'd talk to me about the ways that sports psychologists work with high-level, top-level athletes. And I thought, oh, I can apply that. Oh, I can apply that. And ultimately, I brought that home.
Yeah.
And with Abbie, I think that was the I in AIM, and the I was interrupt. So you and I have these thoughts that come in, and she does thought work, which is one of the things she's so good at. And she says, listen, you don't have to be a victim of your thoughts. You can actually be selective and interrupt, say, I can interrupt that thought, as you say, move it off screen. It doesn't have to take up my brain space. What did you think? One of the really profound, beautiful episodes was with Alex Vasily Frankl, Viktor Frankl's grandson, who runs the Frankl Institute in Vienna. And I remember that was, talking about wisdom, that was a powerful, powerful episode. You and I recorded it. Then, because you have to edit, Mom and I, and Mom's helping with the editing, would then watch it again and listen to it and make copious notes about change that, whatever issues, whether it was visual or it was finding clips that then Sophie could put on social media. So we got to ruminate. We kind of got to stew in each guest's ideas at least 3 times.
Yeah.
Tells you you're learning a lot.
Yeah.
Tells you you're taking a lot in at a deep level. Imagine if you did a course where you're going to have the exact same lesson 3 times in that week. You're going to know that material. And I thought that was good. That was interesting. What struck you about what Alex had to say about his grandfather. Remember the story with the nurse who felt like her life was no longer meaningful because she was ill and unable to be a nurse. And so many other stories that came up in that. Anything come to mind?
That episode in particular was really perfect for being the start of this for us. I think had we gotten Alex a month later into shooting, the podcast would be different.
Yeah.
He was really the first episode that we shot, and we sat down afterwards and went, holy cow, okay, we've got something here.
Right.
That's a testament to him. That's a testament to his story. But, he talked a lot about making the most out of the situation and viewing things just differently with a different perspective. And I like that story in particular with the nurse, and just generally with understanding that things might not be as bad as they appear.
Yeah. He also, for me, said there could be meaning in suffering.
Yeah.
And I think we all just want to push suffering away. And he was saying, listen, sometimes you can push it away. Sometimes you can't. His grandfather was in a concentration camp. He couldn't walk through the gate and say, I don't want this suffering.
Yeah.
So therefore, he instead revealed the meaning that was in it for himself and for the other prisoners, inmates around him.
Wisdom through experience.
Yeah, but also that the whole idea that your suffering has meaning.
Yeah.
Now it transforms suffering. That was amazing to me.
It's changing your relationship with something that is inherently negative and kind of showing us it doesn't have to be negative. And if we draw it back to the wisdom of story, wisdom through experience, maybe you won't gain that wisdom, that depth to your character if you don't have these seemingly negative experiences. An athlete who dove in to the water and injured himself terribly.
You remember why? Because there was a concrete bunker
There was
under
a concrete
the
bunker.
water.
I couldn't remember I couldn't say if it
Yeah,
was
and
a
he
rock.
couldn't see it.
So negative experience, right?
Right.
You're
He
damaged.
went in, he's paralyzed for life.
Yeah, you've damaged your body beyond repair.
Right.
And the thing you love, the thing that you draw value in your life, or how you draw personal value, is no longer on the table for you.
Because he was going to become a professional baseball player.
So how do you make a life after that? And he did. That's, say no more about the story. That's wisdom through experience. Something that I heard recently that I've been saying to friends and talking about is, I don't remember it may have been you who told me this, usually is. We look at our lives as, I think the outlook we generally are taught to have is life is amazing, and then there are downfalls and times that are very hard.
Oh, yeah.
And we say, it's a great life, but sometimes it's hard. And there's another way to look at it, which again inherently seems negative, which is life is pretty tough, but those moments in between are what give life value, meaning, excitement, happiness. That, just like Abbie said, happiness isn't really the goal. In a way, it's an easy goal. Finding the in-betweens is kind of where we find our happiness. I don't need to say that my life is amazing and that every bit of it is great, and sometimes I have these terrible moments. I can also look at it that life's pretty difficult, and I'm proud of myself for being able to get up in the morning. And it doesn't mean that I'm a negative person or I view my life as glass half full. It's acknowledging a pretty hard life, and I've been blessed to have not a hard life by the standards of the millions and billions of people on this planet. I'm very, very blessed for having these experiences, if nothing else. But we shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge the suffering.
Yeah.
That suffering is another way to give our life value, and saying, like, I'm strong enough to be able to push through these hard times. And that adds value. And that in itself can create a form of contentment, happiness, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah. Intro to M. Scott Peck's book, it'll come to me. The Road Less Traveled. I can see the red cover that I got when I got it in London from my friend. I think it was the first paragraph. He says, life is difficult, period. And basically what he goes on to say is, as soon as we acknowledge that life is difficult, it's no longer as difficult. And I think that's kind of a summary of what you've said, which is There's a kid version, and maybe there's a parent version, which is I want to protect her from anything difficult and painful. You should want that. I want her to be safe, of course, but I don't want her to feel pain and struggle.
Yeah.
But the reality is, at some point, you and I go, oh, life is full of pain and struggle.
Yeah.
And thank God wounds heal, most do. And your daughter's going to scrape her knees and get up again. And you know that life is going to have all the struggles, and yet it's so rich. And a conversation I had with Abbie, I think off record, after we finished recording, was we're talking about happiness. And I said to her, telling her about the loss of my mom to a drunk driver when I was a little kid. And I said, and yet I consider myself to be one of the happiest people I know. And she said, so both exist in the same life. I said, yeah.
And maybe
true.
one necessitates the other. I've always had this thought when I think about the people, when I was younger, especially have friends who we'll say are colloquially damaged or struggle, have, personalities that don't mesh. And when I've looked at historically how I've made friends, girlfriends, what are the common threads for me?
Yeah.
And it used to be, and I kind of came up with an analogy, which is not all my own, about the swimmer in a rough ocean.
Okay.
If you have floaties on, and you're floating on the surface of rough ocean, you'll be fine. You'll have water in your face. You'll be dehydrated. You'll be unhappy. But ultimately, you're okay. Big waves come. Little waves come. Little waves, just gloss over. Big wave and floaties or not, you're going under. Mm-hmm. So in a way, that's kind of the person who, I don't know if this person really exists so much as has no struggle, has the floaties,
doesn't exist, but I get the point.
Floaties on from birth,
yeah,
and is handed everything on a silver spoon.
Right.
Then there's the person who doesn't have floaties on, is dropped in the ocean, and little wave comes, or any size wave comes, and they're going under. Then there's people who start drowning because you're going to start drowning at that point.
Yeah.
You don't know how to swim. You've never been in a challenging circumstance in your life. Everyone goes through a challenge and starts sinking.
Over and over, right.
And then you get to the bottom. Then there are the people who are able to climb back up, rather swim back up. Mm-hmm. And those people are going to have a way better chance of surviving a big wave than the ones who are just there with a floaty.
Yeah, that brings me as a rabbi to faith in something bigger than ourselves, name it whatever you want it to be, God or fill in your blank, your choice. But that's the point that tells me I need to make it to the surface because I matter in some small way to this world. I'm here, therefore I need to swim to the surface. I have the capacity in me, that's faith in self. I have the muscles. I have the air. I'm going to rise. I mean, there's certain things as a scuba diver that I can tell you that are, if you are at the bottom, obviously depending on your depth. I know people who have run out of air at the bottom, one person in particular, and he said he made the decision at that point to just go to the surface. And he said, I thought my lungs were going to explode by the time I got there, but the truth is he made it to the surface. Mm-hmm. That swim of 20 seconds, maybe more, maybe less, whatever it was, probably taught him a lot about his capacity in himself, because there were moments along that climb, and I've done that climb from the depth of the ocean, so have you and I in Hawaii, freediving, when I could quit, right? But you're not going to. You're willing yourself to go back to life. Yeah. There's also certain, I love the idea that as a diver, knowing that the bubbles that are so small inside me are going to expand as I go higher. That's kind of a nice analogy.
Hopefully gradually.
Yeah, exactly. But if I keep climbing, the buoyancy within me is naturally going to lift me to the surface too.
And maybe that also means that you can't rush that process. In the diving analogy,
safely.
You cannot just go from 100 feet to sea level on a whim, or you're going to be ill or worse.
Yeah.
So maybe it shows that you need to take the steps gradually. Whatever is challenging you in your life that you're working through, don't expect it to happen overnight. because ultimately it can't. And maybe that will lead you to a less satisfactory result in your life. I want to kind of circle it back, if it's okay, to the podcast itself, because that's a little bit of where we're at. I want to talk about the audience, because that's something that we've always struggled with through this process. It's season 1. We've had
struggled with knowing who they are.
We'll struggle with, first of all, knowing who they are. Who is the person who is listening to this podcast? But also, how do we give that person more of what they want? It's building a profile. A marketer would say we're having to develop an idea of who we want to actually be the audience, not just find them. Because we want all the listeners to be active members of the Meaning Mindset community.
Right. And get the mug when the mug comes out.
And get the mug when the mug
soon.
comes out.
Yeah.
I saw they ship today.
Oh, great.
Part of that, I think, for us is trying to figure out where the through line is between our episodes. Because like I said, like we started this was not done on a whim, because it took years to develop conceptually. But we had to figure out what this meant to us. What was the meaning behind the Meaning Mindset?
Yeah.
Where do you think that came from? Where do you think, first of all, from ignoring the audience bit, which will be
well, I want to touch on
question,
that too. First of all, about the audience, I asked Morgan, who's our marketing guru for the podcast, I said, who's the audience? And she said, well, your audience that's listening to this, because we see who they are, and she knows conceptually, are people who are reflective. Yeah. And typically, that's not, even though you're in your mid-20s, you may not be typical of people in the mid-20s. Maybe you are. I don't know. I don't know in terms of generations, Gen X, Y, Z, but there's a certain point when people start to look for wisdom, when they pull certain books off the shelf and subscribe to certain podcasts, because they're at a point where their mirror is for more than just their hair and their makeup, whatever. And you're clearly there, have been for a long time.
Blame the parents.
Well, blame us. But you're definitely somebody who's invested in depth and digging in understanding life and understanding yourself. You send me Malcolm Gladwell podcasts. You send me all these things, and I go, oh, this is amazing. When you were 22 and sending me a podcast, I go, he's interested in that conversation. That's amazing. So that's one thing. It's people who are interested in deepening themselves. They want a better tomorrow than today. Maybe that's it in the bumper sticker slogan. Now, there's another thing, which is we're starting to see through Sophie's work that we're reaching people literally across the globe. And it reminds me when I mentioned the World Series in a post, and somebody in Australia said, how come you Americans think the World Series is the world, your country's the world, how come we're not playing in it? And somebody else says, because we're terrible at baseball, another Australian. But the reality is a podcast is global in its reach. I love the fact that you were doing an episode with me. I was here in Calabasas. You were in Lithuania, and we were doing this because of technology. We had Carl Honoré joining us in London. We had Vanessa May joining us in London. We had Victor Frankel's grandson, Alex, joining us from Vienna. So we can be anywhere. Jonathan Morris from New York. So it is global by design because of technology. Sometimes I'm across the table from somebody, and you, as you said, aren't even in the room, but you're producing it. Sometimes you're right there. Sometimes I'm looking on a screen and I'm joining somebody from wherever they are in the world. So it's definitely global. If we assume that every guest has their own audience that they're then sharing this to, then we're really probably potentially starting to see that we're reaching different parts of the world. And I think that's a reminder to us that we can't be too American-centric because it's rude. And it's
might say.
No, I mean, it lacks humility to think that our issues, our elections, our, baseball victories or losses are what matter. We live in a planet, and podcast world is planetary. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's kind of been a core tenet of this is different perspective. We've had one thing the audience doesn't see, which I alluded to earlier, is we start a conversation, someone comes into the studio, or we join them via Riverside. And there's conversations that happen before you guys even get into it, before we press record.
Right.
I think we try to limit those conversations, not because we aren't interested or we want to be rude, but because the nature of the platform and the medium is, like you said, we're not scripted.
Yeah, it's
We
informal,
want to
spontaneous.
hear the raw, we'll call it semi-unedited, mostly unedited
Yeah.
version of someone's perspective in relation to other episodes, in relation to other leaders, thought leaders, influencers. So that's been a big part of this, is trying to find alternate perspectives. And ultimately, if we think that experience is a key part of existence and wisdom, then hearing other people's experiences can only help us. And I think that's something that, globalization, for the most part, we think is probably a good thing. Some would argue not, but for thought, certainly.
Yeah.
So if we are exploring the thoughts of people living very different lives and hearing stories of people living very different lives, that can only benefit us.
Which brings me to diversity of thought. And, I do a lot of work in the interreligious world.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I loved sitting here with Pastor Grace Park in one episode.
One of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, me too. And one of my absolute favorites also, Pastor Dave Roberts. Mm-hmm. I just thought this is, first of all, aside from a great conversation and so much richness and wisdom, this is diversity of experience and thought. Here she's across the table with her experiences, I'm with mine. That's good modeling. That when I met Pope Francis the first time, and it was on the piazza at St. Peter's, one of the things that happened for me was I knew that when I was with the Pope in a conversation up on the platform, there were 6,000 to 10,000 people apparently in the piazza on the plaza. It was on these giant screens as well. So there was a close-up to me with my blue yarmulke and the Pope with his white equivalent, standing arm in arm, this close together, forehead to forehead. And he asked me in that moment to bless him. That was part of our conversation, and I did. It was an amazing, humbling moment in my life. But one of the things that struck me was after that moment, turning away and seeing how many people witnessed that. And I thought, even if it changes somebody's heart, even if one person out in that crowd thinks differently about Jewish people, Catholic people, the bridge between us, what we share, the obvious humble connection between these two people in that moment, there's benefit in it. There's value to it. Can you talk a little about how we get to podcasts? We know that we invite a guest and they hopefully say yes. And by the way, because we're getting, I think even in season 1, such interesting, I'll call it high-level interest guests, it's giving us the ability to attract more and more interesting people to the podcast. So what happens is you set us up to do the tech. You're literally usually headphones on in the corner listening. We're not editing out words. You're not saying, afterwards, I didn't like his political view, any of that. We've never done that.
Yeah.
But it's more, talk us through the process of how we get from a conversation to an episode.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's not, like you said, an edited medium. We look at these podcasts, we had to choose a lane. Do we want to be a highly produced,
we did discuss that,
scripted podcast that is like an audiobook?
Right.
Or do we want to be a long form, unscripted, anything goes? And I think we kind of try to find the middle ground where we are setting a bit of a time limit,
right?
Because otherwise, I can see you going on forever in very
I'm
many
enjoying
different
this,
directions.
by the way. No idea how long we've been talking.
Yeah, we'll have to figure that out at some point because no one's watching. No one's watching the screen. Hopefully people are watching at home.
Yeah.
But we essentially will go and meet with the person very, very quickly, usually via email. And again, we try not to have a pre-conversation.
No, but what I'll do is I'll read their book if it's a book, watch their media, Carl Honoré, watch his TED Talks, read his book. So I feel like I'm prepared for the conversation. Yeah.
And then we set a time to meet virtually or in person in the studio. And we sit down. And again, we keep the conversations brief because I think when you're you're a very interesting guy and you're very inquisitive and, like you said, curious. Your forehead tattoo, very curious guy. It's very easy to get into a deep conversation without even trying. So our intent is to get right into it, and that might be the first time. Usually is the first time you're interacting with them.
Yeah.
We film an episode, goes on about an hour, and then we take that footage back, and I'll go through and make an initial edit, and then you and your wife, who has been
she's been amazing in this.
She's
got such a good eye. She has. Mom's been amazing.
Yeah.
And she didn't know she'd be a part of this.
Well, what she does is she will go through with you guys or with you, and you will go through the entire episode and say, all right, I mean, first of all, the simple stuff. Ron is taking a drink. Let's cut that out. Or I really want to add more emphasis to this moment here. But usually if we do an hour and 10-minute recording, we're cutting down 5 minutes maybe.
Right.
And that's pretty much never to take out content. It's never to edit someone's message. We want to just
make a better episode.
Yeah, make a better episode. Make it something that people will be engaged with from top to bottom.
Yeah, what Mom does typically, because we were just doing it, is she'll be watching the episode and saying, switch from the 3 shot, when it was 3 of us on screen, to the 1 shot, because we've had that too long, or we need a change of focus at that point. And if there was any kind of audio glitch, she tends to catch it. And content-wise, as you say, she's listening really, really carefully. Rarely, I can't remember her ever say, there was one point in the episode with the Yale guys where she said, you reading out the list of all the chapter headings is kind of boring to watch. So she said, Jonah, cut from, this minute, this second to this minute, this second. We don't need that.
Yeah. So it's nice having a family ordeal. You're the host, we're the producers. Something I think we always knew would happen.
Yeah.
But it's nice to have other people on the team too. It's been the addition of Morgan, been the addition of Sophie.
Yeah.
So, I think we probably need to start wrapping up. So I'm just going to go through here. What do you think has been one of the biggest challenges of producing this?
Initially getting guests, because who's going to return my email is the first thing. So I'll send an email.
You have a pretty good resume, we'll say.
Yeah, but I think, so interestingly, in academia, I get responses all the time. Authors, look, I'm looking at our list of people. Yeah, I think they've found that often, depending on who they are, they have a team that's reading these emails and saying, you should get on this show. So that's worked well. Where I haven't had that is anybody in Hollywood. I found that I find somebody who has a really interesting story. I'm not starstruck. I'm not interested in them because of the movie they were in. I'm really interested in them because I think they have an interesting story to tell. And what I imagine happens, and that's the difficulty, is getting past the agent's assistant who maybe sees it and goes, oh, it's another podcast. I'm going to throw that away, regardless of what it is. Okay, that'll change. I don't know that there's other difficulty. I think it's just that. It's just finding the right guests. So for me, for season 2, I want to sit with you and Morgan and Sophie, and when we get to end of season 1 and say, okay, what worked? What had the most traction and interest? How do we grow the audience? And what do we want to bring into the next season? It may be that we want to bring somebody back because it was such a good conversation and so well received that we want to continue it. And as you said early in this conversation, there were certain people that came out of conversations. Chad Cromwell, the drummer, said, you're talking about this amazing artist in country music these days. And you made a note, said, Dad, let's see if we can book this guy. Yeah. He sounds amazing. So hopefully that happens in season 2.
And also that's something we want contribution from our guests and especially from our audience.
Yeah.
We'd love to know from the audience, who would you like to hear? Who did you think of when you were listening to Carla Honoré or Jonathan Morris? Who came to your mind? A part of this is, well, why do we do this? We do this because at the end of the day, we want to listen to these people talk.
Yeah, I feel
the
like
bit of
my absolute mission became very, very clear in doing it, not beforehand. Beforehand, again, if you're talking about something as amorphous as meaning, what's it actually going to sound like? What's it going to look like? It's become really clear to me. And it's really because I'm sitting in the room with my son with headphones on that I thought every time I'm in these conversations with the guests, I go, wow, you get to hear that. That made it really clear to me. That's my mission. Mm-hmm. My mission is for this good, wise content to get out there in the world, because some of it could actually save a life.
Yeah.
You know, you and I know the parts we're talking about. Some of it could turn people, change their direction towards something better. And if that's what comes out of this as a permanent record of a conversation in the world,
Yeah.
I'd be very, very happy.
Yeah, I think this episode as it is right now, which will be kind of separate from the season because it's reflective like we talked about. And this is a big part of why we do it, and a big part of being a responsible and well-rounded human being is we're kind of looking behind the stories here.
Definitely. I want to thank you.
Likewise.
You've given, first of all, for this conversation, obviously. You and I talk a lot, but this is different. You're not usually, you're always behind the scenes in anything we've done, and here you are sitting with the mic in front of you. That's
definitely different.
Definitely. But also, you devote so much time and thought to this. I sit here for an hour with a guest. You have hours of work after that, doing all the post-production stuff on it.
Hours I'm going to have to look at my face.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I know. Well, it's a good-looking face to look at.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Our producer and editor is Jonah Lee Paz. Our musical theme is composed by Amos Plessner. And our logo, graphic design by Janice Rudnunski. Find us wherever you find your podcasts.